Well, hi everyone. Thanks for waiting here with me until Stephen Colbert starts. So I'll get into it. 20 minutes isn't a lot of time. So does anyone have an IZON camera? All right, one day I'm going to get someone that says yes. So IZON's actually a really neat IP camera. It obviously has a very Apple aesthetic, very white and cool cylindrical shape and all that. It's sold in Apple stores, Walmart's, Amazon. It's kind of your generic, I want a new IP camera that's Wi-Fi enabled, has a mobile app that I can view when I'm not home and see what's happening in my house when I'm away. So it's an international product. They actually have quite a few distributors around the world for this camera, and the application of that camera in various homes and businesses is pretty common. It really fills that niche between I want to spend $100 or so on a camera but not buy a security system, right? So with any sort of network that you might manage, at some point you might run an NMAP scan or two. I was actually looking for a Raspberry Pi on my network and couldn't find what IP it was actually bound to with DHCP, so I happened to do a scan on my network one day, and this is what I got back for one of the devices. Now in 2013, when I did this research, you probably would think that seeing Telnet on your home network is probably not usually something you want. I was in that boat, so certainly after I saw Telnet, I wondered, well, what is this device? Why is it on my network? How did it get there? To be shocked and dumbfounded that it was actually the IP camera I had bought a few months prior. Now, not only did I buy one of these for myself, but I actually bought one for my brother. So as we go through these slides, keep in mind if I'm a good brother or not. The camera itself is very much an Apple-specific product. It's only supporting iOS. The setup for it is kind of getting more common now, where you actually configure on your mobile app the details about your Wi-Fi network or the setup configuration, because that's a pretty easy interface to work with, and then it actually generates a QR code, and you can actually just hold the QR code up to the camera. It'll actually read the data off the QR code with the camera's own normal video lens, and it'll actually pair up and configure Wi-Fi details, credentials, just by using that interface. So pretty neat. I realize that's probably a little hard to see, but so that's an example of the QR code you might have set up. When I was building this deck, I actually had, like everyone else when they build a deck, Google image search is your friend, looking around for a screenshot of that because I didn't have one offhand. And that screenshot, although it wasn't directly from the vendor, was certainly at one point on the vendor's website, because if you look at the breakdown of what the QR code has in it, it's actually a STEM office, which STEM Innovation is the parent company of this product. So it says STEM Office, I think 136 up there, and then the WPA key or similar is We Live Apple. So I'm just guessing if you happen to swing by their offices one day and try to connect to their Wi-Fi, that may work for you. Just keep in mind if you ever post a QR code online, it might actually have details you didn't remember. So multicast DNS is, I think, for a lot of embedded devices these days, preferred way to let your network know, hey, there's this thing you should set up and configure and pair with a mobile app or a desktop piece of software. This is no different. A couple noted items, of course, the CPU we see is ARM, and we also see that it's running Linux, so now we have a little bit of insight into this device. Because like most cameras on the retail market, consumer-oriented, we don't necessarily know what it's running. We can all make a pretty quick assumption that it's Linux, but we never know until we kind of dive in. Very appropriate for this conference, one of the things that happens when you boot up this camera is it actually transfers this RSA public key over the wire. And for security researchers that kind of jump into a project, once you start looking at network traffic, if you see a public key like this come over the wire, you kind of assume that security is pretty good. Obviously they're encrypting data, and that's great. Unfortunately, what turned out to be the case was while this public key is used, it is one of the only times with this device, with its mobile app, that any encryption is used at all. So very odd that they started really strong and then really went downhill pretty quick, as we'll see. What it's using with that public key for is the camera itself is generating a private key. the public side of that public-private key pair is going over to your device, and then what's happening is your mobile app is actually generating an administrative password, taking that administrative password, encrypting it, sending it back over the wire. So now the camera knows what the admin password is, the mobile phone knows what the admin password is, but obviously over the wire you can't decrypt that without having the private key, which you don't inherently have. Kind of skipping ahead a little bit, just so you can kind of see where a little bit of the road we're going to go down with this is the camera and the phone are actually paired one-to-one. You cannot have multiple devices paired up with different accounts. For instance, you have to basically share credentials if you want to have one camera attached to many devices. So it's that account can be opted in on many devices, but again, it's shared credentials, and that kind of set me up in thinking maybe this isn't going to be a very secure system, because as we know, shared credentials is rarely the right way to do things in terms of access control. You can manipulate the device in such ways that we'll chat about in a few minutes, but basically what happens if you unpair that initial account from this camera, it actually just completely goes factory reset. There's some process output from it, and I think factory reset, complete reset is probably one of the most specific and unambiguous things I've ever seen from a Linux system. So good for them on that one. But the fun part is if you happen to ever change the admin password, everything falls apart. Why that's important is now we know the admin password is basically used for everything between the camera and the phone and otherwise, as we'll see. Gaining access to an ecosystem like this where you have a mobile app, you have a camera, you have cloud services, all these different things that we represent in an IoT ecosystem, you have to figure out how you're actually going to get those credentials that are being operated with. So we know the admin account exists. We know it has a password, but we don't know what the password is. How then can we actually gain access to this camera if we don't have the password offhand? The trick is to figure out what you can leverage, and in our case, we know that admin password by default goes over the wire encrypted, so we can't do that. We later find out that the transactions going over the wire are actually using HTTP digest authentication, which if you've ever had to do that is, again, you have a secret that you don't know because of the digest authentication, so we can't use that. Brute forcing is always an option, but over the wire, if you don't have direct access to the device, brute forcing could be a very lossy process. It could take weeks or years. Who knows how long the password is, so you can't really perhaps understand what you're going to break into if you want to do, like, say, a four-digit PIN or something. You think it's a really bad password, or it could be a 32 mixed case, mixed alpha num and all this other stuff. So it's kind of a bad losing effort in most cases if you try to brute force this over the wire. And hardware modification wasn't something I had worked with much, so it just didn't seem like the most practical way to go about it. And there's just an example over the wire of the digest authentication. If you've never worked with digest authentication before, all the values are known except for the secret that's actually creating part of the digest, or I should say, involved in the digest creation. And one thing we'll see at the very far side of that screenshot is the nonce counter is actually set to 1. The bad news is it's actually set to 1 on every single packet, which if, again, you've ever worked with digest authentication, the reason you increment that is to prevent replay attacks. So if you steal a packet and then replay it, it shouldn't work. They did not actually implement that properly, so you can replay any packet you receive over the wire and just pretend like you're the administrative user in that case. So if we can't access the camera, we can't do anything over the wire, what are we going to do? If we can crack the app, we can then dump that clear text blob of the app and see if anything's inside of that. It's very easy to do if you have a jailbroken phone. There's really no talent to it. You basically load up the app, run a quick command you get from the off-market app store, if you will, and you get the unencrypted version of that app. So very quickly, with either IDA or strings or any other number of ways to look at contents of a binary blob with some ASCII in it, we very quickly see there's actually a kind of a unique scenario, in my opinion, that they have a shell script that connects over telnet that authenticates as root, and that's actually how they do firmware upgrades. So obviously telnet's terrible. piping shell scripts over a clear text protocol to do firmware upgrades is terrible, but what's worse is they give you the root password at the same time from this mobile app. And as you can see there, the password is literally STEM root. So again, STEM Innovations, the company, root is root, and that is their very complex and awesome password. This is, of course, hard-coded, and so every camera at the point of sale actually has this set of credentials on the camera. So there's a login screenshot. We see we're root, we check in and notice that we're again running Linux, we're running an ARM processor, so kind of what we had got out of the multicast DNS. The bottom screenshot is just an output of all the ports that are mapped to processes. Nothing too shocking here. Some web servers, a watchdog, a couple services that look like they're related to video service, so nothing too crazy there, but interesting to see nonetheless. This is where things keep getting interesting. The actual passwords in this Linux operating system are encrypted with what's known as DES CRYPT. If you're a Linux person or a crypto person, you know that DES CRYPT is not an acceptable way to do things. It actually has a limit of 8 characters. So very quickly, that bottom screenshot shows I cracked one of the passwords in 47 seconds on my Mac. And the other password I actually had a little help with from the guys at Occupant Labs. But these, again, are all hard-coded passwords. If you have access to one of these cameras anywhere, these passwords would log you into various levels of privilege. We see that there's a lighttpd web server running. Again, we see passwords in a file. These passwords are protected, of course, because they're a hash. So rather than brute forcing the hash, we look around the system and find out there's actually a config file for Lua, which is one of the underlying languages that run the actual services and firmware. The admin password, as you can see, is a very long, very complex, kind of GUID type password. However, there's actually an account that says user, and that's literally, again, a web interface set of credentials that would work on any camera out of the box. If you happen to go to the camera itself and go to the just normal HTTP port 80 on the camera, you could actually log in with user. You could then view the stream of the camera. You could look up firmware details, see what the alert settings were for different alarms like motion and audio. So you basically had full knowledge of what the camera was doing. You just couldn't manipulate the camera. But of course, with the camera itself, there are API keys because there are third-party services that handle video streaming, video alert uploads, and that kind of service. And those are all shown to you. So you can basically just go to the third-party services, log in with your API keys, and interrogate data, work with data directly if you were so inclined. Again, this is just with user as credentials. You can also see the video from the actual camera mapped out with the kind of motion detector blocks. You can do a wireless scan of the co-tenant areas of that camera. So if you happen to find this camera over the internet, you could then look and see if there are any Wi-Fi points nearby that would give you a better sense of where that camera might be. I've definitely had neighbors that actually put their street address into their SSID because why not? Firmware details, LED actions. You could actually flip the LEDs for fun if you were, if you wanted to maybe mess with someone a little bit. And there's some details below there on the API for one of the services they use. Quickly, one of the main things that I found out about is a third party called Intellivision that they were using. If anyone's ever used Amazon S3 before, they've definitely missed some best practices with that. Every customer's files were uploaded to the exact same S3 bucket. None of the files were uploaded encrypted. None of the files were using any sort of encryption once they were uploaded. The files themselves had a very structured file name process, and the data the credentials related to this S3 bucket were, again, hard-coded in the mobile app. Now, I didn't try to connect to this bucket with those credentials, but one could infer very quickly that perhaps you have read access to everyone's video files from this camera for all alerts ever uploaded. Kind of a big deal. A fun feature is that I deleted a file on July 10th, 2003 from the mobile app like you normally should use the camera. I then looked at that same HTTP endpoint for that file name 2 months later, and the file was still there. So not only do the files get uploaded unencrypted, not only are the files perhaps available to any attacker that has those hard-coded credentials in the mobile app, But if you delete a file, it may not actually get deleted off the service. Another interesting one was a service called YoICS, and this is actually the one that you do your live streaming with. So if you open up the mobile app, you look at it from a Starbucks, you could then see this data come through. None of the data that's actually transmitting for your video stream is encrypted, because why would you do that? It also opens up a public proxy that goes directly back into your camera's web interface. So that's how it's actually connecting back, is just basically a reverse proxy. And those reverse proxies are actually not really restricted on the internet at all. So some additional things for YoICS. Basically, your password that you set up for your STEM Innovation personal account is actually transmitted directly to this third-party service. They then use API queries that are completely clear text, and they actually use an MD5 sum of that password that you've already set up with your account to then do API calls. So if you were on a Starbucks network, not only would you have your clear text API calls going over the wire with your secret token, that's not so secret, but you would also have that clear text one give your MD5 sum of your account password. So if you didn't have a good password, it's very feasible for someone to crack, brute force the MD5 hash and get your actual password out of that, and then just log in as you and view your camera or administrator or do whatever else you would want to. So there's just some quick examples of the API calls. And again, all these are clear text. There's no enabled mode to actually to do encryption, unfortunately. So looking at Shodan, I found 62 cameras just from a quick search on there. I didn't do any ZMAP scans of the internet or anything like that. But because it does have telnet listening, I actually used that rather than the HTTP web service, because I thought, hey, the telnet, I have a very distinct banner. Let me look for that. Excuse me. And so in a quick search of Shodan back in, I think this was maybe June or July, perhaps. Oh, July, perfect. Those details came up. Again, I didn't test any of these, but based on the telnet banner, very unique. I don't think there are any false positives in that list, but of course, this is only stuff that I could find over the internet. If you live in an apartment complex or some sort of condo units or whatever else that you might have shared Wi-Fi, you probably could find a couple of these as well. So there's kind of the laundry list of issues. Some of these I went a little quicker past than others, obviously time constrained. But overall, you can see that this is one camera. This is just one Internet of Things device. And that's a lot of issues, right? The lack of encryption for things, the lack of unique credentials, just really bare basic security that we all expect to have as consumers were not found at all within this process. Vendor disclosure, more or less, I knew I was going to give this research back in the fall. I started contacting the vendor to do coordinated disclosure to get these things patched, of course. They were very slow. I basically had to bother them constantly to even talk to me. By the time I was saying, hey, I'm going to go to this week to give this research for the first time, I'd love to have some of these things resolved or at least have your comment on them, they then started saying, oh, we'll talk to you. And then I told them, hey, here's my availability. Here's when I'd love to talk to you the very next day. They never even responded back to me. I've never heard back since sometime in October. The good news is I have seen updates come out. I have seen the iOS updates come through. They mentioned security fixes very ambiguously. There have been firmware updates. For what I know, I haven't tested super in depth, but for what I know, all of the main issues within here are fixed. So that's the happy ending of this. So if you were scared to raise your hand earlier, if you own a camera, good news is most of these things are probably not issues anymore. So that's a very quick run through. I actually have these slides on that speaker deck address, and there's a much broader and wider deck than this. So if you want to check out some more detail into this, please feel free to check that out. There also was some coverage on this online, a couple of different, CSO Online, Security Ledger. So if you want to hear a little bit more of the background on this, please look up those stories. Does anyone have any quick questions? Does anyone want to know about their camera that they have at their home? Oh, yeah, so my brother's camera. So I'm going to be buying him a new camera soon. I'll just pretend like it's a brand new gift and do that. But no, it's one of those things, like, honestly, these devices are great. There's no question about that. They're convenient. They're very, their interactivity with these kinds of things have never been better. But at the same time, as consumers, I think most of us would assume that these companies would go through some basic audit process. Most of these vulnerabilities took me about a half hour to find. I mean, and that's not because of my skill set, that's because of how bad these vulnerabilities were, right? So just magnify this across all the things that you're popping on your network, and you might want to take a look at some of these yourselves. These are really cool research projects, of course, because you can test within your own network. You don't have to go and attack servers on the internet. By looking at your mobile app, by looking at the device itself, and your personal network traffic, you can very quickly find some of these devices, and they make, again, really good research projects. And I think we're adding a lot of value to the overall consumer community when we can get some of these issues patched, because if the vendor's not looking out for you, then I guess that's up to us now, right? So, any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I mean, if there's us and the vendors, but is there any push for legislation?
So the FTC, great question. The FTC, the question was, is there any push for kind of legislation to protect all of us? The FTC actually came down on the company TrendNet last year. They had 700 cameras published to the internet that had an unauthenticated URL that would stream anyone's video camera for, I think, 4 or 5 of their products. Now, I didn't make a list of these that you could go out and look at directly, so I don't think the FTC quite got as upset as they did with TrendNet's scenario. But the FTC did put 2 years, they put 20 years of kind of, in their settlement of control around this company. So every 2 years they have to have a full audit, they have to establish a security program that's obviously ongoing, and they also are not allowed to use the word secure with their products anymore. So for a vendor in that space, not being able to say secure is kind of a death blow in a little bit of a way. But I expect the FTC to come down on more companies. I don't see why they wouldn't, and there's certainly no shortage of companies. If you go to a lot of these talks at different conferences, this kind of story is a very common story, unfortunately, for us.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on wearables? We're seeing a lot of those come out. CES was just here. There's a lot of scanning coming out of those. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so wearables, I'm a big picture attack guy. A lot of wearables, of course, may have Wi-Fi enablement, but a lot of them are Bluetooth LE or other local area protocols, I guess, if you want to put it that way. We have a lot more concern of, so for instance, our badges, if you didn't notice, are NFC, and you can actually reprogram them because no one turned off the write capability on the badges. And a friend of mine was actually, some of our badges, he was reflashing with a URL that would automatically launch on your phone if you hit it. So those kinds of worries should be kind of at the forefront, I think, of what can people do if they bump into you. Obviously, credit cards for a number of years have had RFID chips in them, Amex and similar. Those kinds of attacks are pretty scary, but I think anything we're popping on the Internet of Things, third-party services that we don't know maybe the attack surface of. If you look at the company If This Then That, that actually lets you integrate over 80 platforms of Internet of Things devices and services. Imagine if they got hacked. If they offer 80 platforms to integrate with and they have 1 million customers, just imagine how many devices an attacker would have access to. So those kinds of things keep me up a little bit more than maybe some of the wearables right now. But who knows? It only takes one good research project to change my mind. So.
Okay, that wraps up our session for today. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, guys.